Welcome to Chapter 5, Public Opinion. As we discussed in the first third of the class, the consent of the governed, demanded in the Declaration of Independence, is critical for the functioning of a democracy. Americans expect government to pay attention to the people. The issue arises when there is controversy over whose opinion is more important and whose opinion should drive public policy decisions. That's where public opinion polls can be helpful to decision makers. As we will see in this chapter, research shows that public opinion does have a significant impact upon public policy. The problem arises when the population isn't knowledgeable about policy choices or informed about politics. There is also the criticism that elected officials only represent the interests of some Americans, not all of us. So this chapter is going to focus on three central topics. 1, how do we know what public opinion is? 2, what are the origins of public opinion and how does it manifest in our politics and policy? And 3, how can public opinion be measured accurately? Public opinion plays a very big role in the political process. It influences media coverage, public policy decisions, and who does and does not seek public office. Most social scientists who study public opinion and public policy in democratic countries agree that public opinion influences public policy, and the more salient an issue is to the public, the stronger the relationship between the will of the people and the behavior of our elected officials is likely to be. And that relationship is threatened by the power of interest organizations, political parties, and economic elites. There is much less consensus on how much impact public opinion has on public policy. And how much does the impact of the opinion on policy increase as the importance of an issue to the public increases? And to what extent do interest groups, social movement organizations, political parties, and elites influence policy even when they're opposed by public opinion? And there's also much less consensus on how government responsiveness to public opinion has changed over time. Let's take a look at what factors influence public opinion in the presence or absence of relevant information. Public opinions are the attitudes that citizens have about political issues, their leaders, governmental institutions, and national and state events. It's important to understand the differences between values and beliefs and attitudes and opinions. Values and beliefs are basic principles that shape a person's opinions about political issues and events. These are a person's basic orientation towards politics. Values and beliefs are held for a long time. They shape a person's perceptions of political issues and events. An attitude or opinion is a specific preference on a particular issue. It may have emerged from a broad belief about a larger political value. Attitudes may be short-lived and change based on changing circumstances or new information. Political values and beliefs are typically long-term and held throughout an individual's lifetime. Factors such as race, gender, income, age, religion, and region influence a person's beliefs and opinions. They are also affected by partisanship and ideology. Opinions about issues in politics can sometimes also be affected by emotions. Public opinion is not purely rational, and once someone becomes emotionally attached to a particular belief, they tend to hold on to those beliefs, even in the face of contradictory information. Political values shared by most Americans are things like liberty, equality of opportunity, and democracy. If you remember from the first few chapters, since the birth of our nation, Americans have always voiced strong support for the idea of liberty and usually support the notion that governmental interference in the lives of individuals should be minimal. Most Americans also believe that all individuals should be allowed to pursue personal and economic success, and most Americans believe that this success should be the result of individual effort and ability. Most Americans also believe in democracy, that every citizen should have the chance to take part in the nation's government and policymaking processes, like voting for his or her own elected officials. And this is known as the American Creed, that most Americans have a widely shared set of values, most Americans think the political system works pretty well, and most Americans believe in First Amendment rights. Any politician who opposes the American Creed will most likely not be elected. Before we proceed, it's important that you understand how all of these things work together, because public policy and candidate preferences are based on this chain of ideas. Core values and ideology. These don't change. They are maintained over time. This is a body of ideas that reflects the beliefs and interests of a nation, a political system, and underlies political action. the set of beliefs by which a group or society organizes their thoughts so they can make sense of the political world. A political ideology is a certain ethical set of ideals, principles, doctrines, myths, or symbols of a social movement, institution, class, or large group that explains how society should work and offers some political and cultural blueprint for a certain social order. A political ideology largely concerns itself with how to allocate power and to what ends it should be used. Some parties follow a certain ideology very closely, while others may take broad inspiration from a group of related ideologies without specifically embracing any one of them. Political ideologies have two dimensions. One is their goals of how society should work, and their methods, which is the most appropriate way to achieve the ideal arrangement. The next thing down the line is attitudes. Attitudes use your core values to decide how government should be run, what programs should be offered, or how much we should pay in taxes. Political attitudes and opinions are consistent with core beliefs and values. Personal ideology lowers the information costs associated with the development of these issue attitudes. People can rely on the liberal conservative continuum when they're trying to determine their ideology, and this promotes rationality. Opinions are next after attitudes, and the stronger an opinion equals less likely to change. Opinions can change with more information. All of these things help the voter to decide which candidate most aligns with his or her preferences. And all these things don't always apply to the one-issue voter, which is someone who votes basically based upon a highly charged issue like the right to life, the death penalty, or the Second Amendment. If you're a one-issue voter, those are the only things that matter to you when you're determining what kind of candidate you're going to vote for. As the book states, the application of America's shared values to specific policies varies quite a bit. The set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs through which we come to understand and interpret politics is called a political ideology. Like I said, liberalism and conservatism are the most common ideologies in the U.S., apart from those who identify as moderate. Individuals embrace ideology to widely varying extents. Liberals and progressives commonly advocate strong civil liberties, social progressivism, cultural pluralism, and government ensuring positive rights, such as education and healthcare, and they prefer a mixed economy. Liberals typically also support extensive government intervention in the economy, progressive taxation, and the expansion of entitlement programs. In international affairs, liberals often support arms control, the United Nations, and are suspicious of the use of American troops to influence the affairs of developing nations. Conservatives commonly defend the national status quo of some point in the past, believing that the nation has deviated significantly from it and advocating more traditional stance on social issues, protection of gun rights, and much less government intervention. Conservatives believe that a large and powerful government is a threat to individual freedom. They also oppose governmental regulations. They support school prayer, and conservatives are concerned about law and order. In international affairs, conservatives believe in the maintenance of military power. Moderates, who might be right or left-leaning, incorporate different aspects from liberalism and conservatism into their personal perspective. According to recent polls, moderates are commonly identified as the second largest group. Moderates are commonly defined through limiting the extent to which they adopt liberal and conservative ideas. Exit polls have found moderates to be rather evenly divided between the country's two main parties. Even though liberals as a whole tend to be the most educated ideological demographic, as indicated by Pew Research, moderates tend to become increasingly conservative with increased economic prosperity, causing the professional class to be split between Republicans and Democrats. Among those who do identify as either liberal or conservative, few identify as far left or far right. Most Americans either identify as moderate or as somewhat liberal or conservative. While often not mentioned in major polls and less organized than liberal or conservatives, libertarians are a significant minority, making up roughly 13% of the electorate. Libertarians commonly hold liberal views on social issues, but conservative views on economic issues. Since the 1980s, a majority of libertarians have favored the Republican Party, although in recent years the margin favoring Republicans has begun to shrink because of libertarians' opposition to many recent Republican-supported social issues. Libertarians also argue that government interferes with freedom of expression, free markets, in society, and thus should be limited to as few spheres of activity as possible, with national defense as a notable exception. And then you have socialists, who argue that more government is necessary to promote justice and to reduce economic inequality. And as you can see from the graphic, socialists are more to the ideological left. An important measure of public opinion is trust in government. High levels of trust create legitimacy for democratic government. So why does this matter? It matters because declining trust is linked to declines in political participation and voting. There's low confidence in government is related to the perception that government cannot solve problems or spend money in effective ways. Many scholars and political pundits argue that Americans are becoming more and more disenchanted with political institutions, regardless of their ideological leanings, and it's not hard to see why. So how is public opinion formed? As we've discussed, people's attitudes about political issues and elected officials tend to be shaped by their underlying political beliefs and values. The processes by which political beliefs and values are formed are collectively called political socialization. The term political socialization is telling because we come to adopt our beliefs not through interacting with others, but through our given context, place, time, and events. This is a point that will be driven home throughout the chapter. What it means is we come to see the world in a certain way due to the stories we hear told about it. And as we get older, we tend to surround ourselves with those who think like we do and who will reinforce our existing beliefs. In order for any nation to survive, and particularly a democracy, it's imperative that its citizens share some fundamental beliefs. Remember, I said that most Americans share a belief in liberty, equality of opportunity, and democracy. But some elements of the American socialization process produce differences in outlooks, where others promote similarities. These elements are known as agents of socialization. The first set is family and social networks. Most people acquire their initial political beliefs from their families, from political conversation or activities. And this also includes their political party preference. Family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors are also an important source of political information and orientation. The second agent is education. Education is often considered a great equalizer, and education is also an important source of differences in political opinions and perspectives. We are supposed to learn a common set of civic values in our K-12 education. And differences in education are also a strong predictor in political outlook. Americans with more education are more likely to vote, join a campaign, protest, and generally participate in the political process. And we've already talked about why that is because these people understand and they know how to participate in politics, and they understand how important it is to participate in politics. The third agent is race and ethnicity. Different races and different ethnicities tend to have different political outlooks and policy attitudes. It's also gender plays a role because men and women have different opinions and different policy preferences. Then you have party affiliation. Political party membership is one of the most important factors affecting political orientation. Partisans tend to rely on party leadership and the media for cues on what positions to take on major political issues. Wide differences in public opinion exist based upon partisanship involving issues such as energy, income equality, infrastructure, job creation, immigration, climate change, national defense, taxes, terrorism, and trade. Republicans and Democrats have very different policy preferences. And the last agent of socialization is the political environment, which includes the historical events that took place when the individual grew up, like the Great Depression, the Vietnam War, and the terrorist attack on 9/11. These events shape people's opinions of government and what it should and should not do. Individuals vary in their attitudes on many specific policies and what politicians can achieve their goals. So what kind of things influence these opinions? Researchers have studied how fundamental attitudes like ideology and party identification influence attitudes on more specific policies and politicians. And these fundamental attitudes are in turn shaped by an individual's parents' party identification and ideology, and other social characteristics such as race or religion are also related to attitude formation. You can see from this graphic of all the things that can affect where political attitudes come from. Like I said, your parents' party ID can affect your party ID. Your parents' ideology can affect your ideology. The amount of education you have, where you live, what your profession is, your race and ethnicity, your religion, and how much money you make. All of these affect your political attitudes. So along with political attitudes comes political knowledge. So I'm sure you'll agree that knowledgeable citizens are better able to evaluate new information and determine its relevancy and consistency with their own views, beliefs, and opinions. More knowledgeable citizens should also be able to recognize their own political interests and act to further those interests. One survey found that 71% of Americans could not name their own member of Congress. The book then raises the question of how much political knowledge is necessary to act as an effective citizen. One important study of political knowledge by Della Carpini and Keeter found that the average American exhibits little knowledge of the political process. They also found that political knowledge is unevenly distributed throughout the population. So more education, income, or of a member of a social or political organization equals more knowledge and becoming more interested in politics. Interest in politics also increases a person's political efficacy, which is the belief that their opinions and actions actually matter and will encourage people to participate. So being informed requires time and energy, which is not always easy to come by. Because it takes so much time and energy to be politically informed, Americans seek to acquire information using shortcuts for political evaluation and decision making, rather than engaging in a long process of decision making, such as relying on cues from party elite or someone they trust who have done all the research. By using these informational shortcuts, even voters with low levels of political knowledge are able to make relatively informed political choices. Because basically what's happening when you rely on shortcuts and cues is you're getting information from trusted party elites, interest groups, your media, family members, friends, social media, and similar sources. Basically, you find somebody that you normally agree with, and then you just let them do all the work. And when they say, vote for Jane Smith for city council, you're like, oh, okay, my friend thinks I should like Jane Smith, so I'll like Jane Smith. Now, there's also called skim and scan. Now, granted, it's much easier now to get information thanks to the internet and social media, but it does still take time to read political information and to stay current. People are also likely to read the news by scanning and skimming multiple headlines online rather than reading an entire news article and getting the whole story. This misinformation can distort public opinion. So what are the costs to democracy if voters have less knowledge or are taking cues from the wrong people? The text suggests that low levels of political knowledge and engagement weaken American democracy in two ways. One, those who lack political information cannot effectively defend their own political interests and possibly become a loser in the political battle. And if knowledge is power, then a lack of knowledge can contribute to growing political and economic inequality. When individuals are unaware of their interests or how to pursue them, it is virtually certain that political outcomes will not favor them. It's important to note that people who are low in political knowledge have a hard time even knowing where to start to learn about politics or getting involved enough to become informed. Students who have studied government early in their lives are not only more able to investigate further, they are also more willing to do so because the process does not seem foreign, overcomplicated, or pointless. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of public opinion in democracy. So public opinion is just what the public thinks. It is a collection and aggregation of individual attitudes and beliefs on one or more issues. Public opinion polls are scientific efforts to measure that opinion, to estimate what an entire group of people think about an issue by asking a smaller sample of the group for their opinion on surveys. Public opinion is important in a democracy for at least two reasons. It's normative, which means we believe public opinion should influence what government does, and it's empirical, because a lot of people behave as though public opinion does matter. To the degree that they measure, record, and react to it, public opinion polls do become a factor in American politics. Elected politicians believe the public is keeping tabs on them. They worry about public opinion. The media focuses on public opinion and makes investment in polls. The media devotes considerable coverage to reporting what the public is thinking. and these polls are used to lend drama to media coverage of important votes in electoral races. Both the media and the government mold public opinion. Opinions about political issues, events, and personalities are not formed in isolation. Typically, individuals are confronted with the efforts of many individuals or groups seeking to persuade them to adopt a particular point of view. The influences manifest as the marketplace of ideas, which is a public forum in which beliefs and ideas are exchanged and compete for attention. Given this constant exposure to the ideas of others, it is almost impossible for most individuals to resist some modification to their own beliefs. There are three powerful sources of influence in the marketplace of ideas: government, private groups, and the media. All governments try to influence, manipulate, or manage their citizens' beliefs, but often governmental claims are disputed by the media, by interest groups, and by opposing factions within the government itself. Private groups, like interest groups, churches, community organizations, and even movie stars, spread their own political ideas that will advance their causes, and their efforts have led to changes in public policies. Other elected officials and popular public figures can similarly influence the public discourse on a smaller scale. Military leaders and other respected officials, such as former secretaries of defense or former secretaries of state, can influence public opinion because of widespread trust in their office or personal qualities. The most strategic groups go on the offensive. They do not wait for news to break, but rather work to influence it to advance a manner favorable to their cause. Of course, many groups also have like-minded individuals seeking them out, and thus can have very developed communication networks. Social networks and other community websites can help to facilitate this phenomenon. These communication networks can be very helpful when reaching out to elected officials about important pieces of legislation. So the interest groups and community organizations can contact their people through social media or through email, and they can say, please call your elected official and tell them to support this bill or to oppose that bill. They can be very effective. So the other very important force shaping public opinion is the media. The media are among the most powerful forces operating in the marketplace of ideas. They are very much opinion makers and have an enormous impact on popular attitudes. We'll discuss the media much further in Chapter 6. But one example of the media's influence is their continual presentation of government corruption that has no doubt contributed to the general attitude of distrust that prevails in much of the general public. At the same time, the way in which the media frames specific events can have a major impact on popular opinion and whether or not the public accepts or rejects something. So the way that media frames things is very, very important, and we're going to talk about that next week in the next chapter. But keep in mind that the media can spin stories to really follow any narrative that they are trying to promote. Government policies also help to shape public opinion. Studies generally show that elected officials pay attention to what the public wants, especially if they want to be reelected. However, there is reason to question whether prevailing public opinion causes politicians to make policies that affect the general will, or whether government policy in fact causes changes in the public opinion. The relationship between government policy and opinion may be dynamic, wherein policy responds to opinion, but opinion also shifts based on new government policies. Of course, public opinion and policy do not always align, and officials may act on their own preferences or judgment if they believe it will benefit government or society. Sometimes elected officials just have access to more information than the general public, and they'll make decisions based upon that information and not what the public actually thinks that they want. This cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes kind of just reiterates that point. Calvin says, here's the latest poll on your performance, Dad. Your approval rating is pretty low, I'm afraid. And the dad says, that's because there's not necessarily any connection between what's good and what's popular. I do it right, what's right, not what gets approval. And Calvin says, you'll never keep the job with that attitude. And the dad says, if someone else offers to do it, let me know. So basically the dad is saying that there's not really any connection between what's good and what's popular, and that is actually a lot of times public officials are faced with that same decision. So let's talk a little bit about polling. So polling is highly scientific and it's big business. The American National Election Study is a very well-respected and long-term poll that conducts time series studies during national election years. In presidential election years, the study is typically conducted both before and after the election. There's a pre and post election survey during presidential years, but typically they only do polling after congressional elections. This poll has been going on since 1948, and they do in-person interviewing. Topics cover voting behavior in elections, together with questions on public opinion and attitudes of the electorate. It's very scientific. It's the best available data if you are going to do political science research on public opinion trends over time. They are very careful with the wording of the survey questions because the precise words used in a question can have enormous impact on the answer the question elicits. And just remember that the scientifically conducted surveys can be very expensive, but they're worth the price when you want good data. Now, we have been trying to measure public opinion for a very long time, and before they started with the American National Election Studies in 1948, there were national magazines that published straw polls. One of these was called the Literary Digest. Now, a straw poll is a vote with non-binding results. You may have done this if you belong to an organization like Future Teachers or Future Farmers, or if you belong to a sorority or fraternity, you may do a straw poll, which is a vote with non-binding results. And basically what happens is it provides dialogue among movements within large groups. And the state parties will do these in an attempt to determine who is ahead in a political race. So straw polls are common in American political caucuses. It can be taken before selecting delegates and voting on resolutions. They can be very influential. A candidate might drop out if they see they have no support during a straw poll. So Literary Digest, which was a magazine back in the early parts of the 1900s, would mail sample ballots to its readers months before a presidential election. And from 1920 to 1932, these polls predicted the election result. But in 1936, the Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would win the presidency over Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And we all know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt won. So why do you think the Literary Digest was wrong in 1936? Think a little bit about the country's economic conditions in 1936. Some reasons that they were wrong would be that, number one, is people who did not have a lot of money might have canceled their magazine subscription, whereas wealthy people were more likely to still receive the magazine. So this means that people who were struggling economically didn't have a chance to vote. And those were the people who were probably going to vote for Roosevelt in the election. Number two, the poll was taken a long time before the election. And a lot can change in the month leading up to election day. And number three is they also used automobile registrations to help form the sample, which likely further biased the sample by overrepresenting people who were wealthy, who were more likely to vote for Alf Landon that year. And those are some of the reasons why the poll was wrong in 1936. Now, most presidential polls have between 500 and 1,200 respondents. The key is to getting an accurate sample, one that mirrors the population as closely as possible. You typically want to poll likely voters. But that's how they got the 2016 election wrong, because many of Trump's voters that year were not likely voters. They may have never voted before, they didn't vote on a regular basis, so they would not have been included in any of the public opinion polls. So in statistical research, the population is what's the entire group about which you want to learn, such as all voting age adults in the United States. So the sample, that's what they use when they do the survey. The sample is the subset of the population that is chosen to provide information and answer the survey for the research about the population. Random selection refers to choosing a sample such that each member of a population has an equal chance of being selected into the sample. As the sample gets larger, it increasingly approximates the entire population. Although many people tend to discount polls if they don't like the results, most social scientists and political pollsters conduct public opinion surveys with the highest standards of scientific accuracy possible. Public officials use public opinion polls to help them decide whether to run for office, what policies to support, and how to vote on important legislation, and what type of appeals to make in their campaigns. Now, I have worked in politics and government for a long time, and I've never seen a elected official do a poll to determine how to vote on important legislation. But they do polls to figure out how they're doing in a race, what issues are most important to the voters, and things like that. Elected officials also can glean public opinion from the letters, phone calls, and email they receive from their constituents. They can also learn things from talking to constituents at public meetings, at the grocery store, and at church, basically everywhere you go. But back to the poll. Since you can't feasibly interview the more than 300 million Americans living in the United States on their opinion, pollsters take, just like I said, a sample of the population. And they use that sample to make an estimation or an inference of what everyone else thinks. It's important to have a truly representative sample, one that does not overrepresent any portion of the population. You don't want too many old or young people, rich, poor, too many males, too many females. You want it to be, an accurate sample. Now, sample bias is the effect of having a sample that does not represent all segments of the population. This means you're not going to get really good data. Self-selected people are not random. They're not a representative sample. So this is not the type of poll the media refer to as a scientific poll. Like, these are the ones that the elected officials use for decisions about their campaigns and issues. Those are scientific polls. A self-selected poll is when you are scrolling through something on social media and you see a poll and you choose to answer it. That's self-selection, and that's not a scientific poll. So let's talk a little bit about the margin of error. The margin of error is important when you are evaluating polling results. The margin of error is the range of outcomes expected for a population given the data revealed by a sample drawn from that population. So basically, if it says that 52% are planning to vote for the Democrat and 48% are planning to vote for the Republican in a race, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3, that basically means that the results could be 3 points higher than 52 or 3 points lower than 52. So it could be that, so basically that means that 49 to 55% of the people plan to vote for the Democrat. And then it means that with the Republican candidate, it means that 45% to 52% plan to vote for the Republican. Now, because there's a percentage of each that overlaps in the 49 to 52% range, this race would be too close to call. And that's the reason the media won't call certain elections, because the models can show each candidate winning. So proper survey design must consider question wording. So unbiased sample is one that does not accurately represent the overall population. It is therefore likely to lead to erroneous conclusions about the population. Now, while scholars today know that self-selection, like I said, and about the Literary Digest, which was a self-selection, is biased, there are still plenty of polls reported in the media that are based on self-selection. And these are ones that you can find like on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or internet polls. And you can also think about like American Idol or Dancing with the Stars as examples of self-selection polling. So it's important, in order to make the poll scientific, you want to make sure you have proper survey design, that your survey questions are worded precisely or they can jeopardize the reliability of the survey results, and you're using a random sample. Researchers tend to use random digit dialing to get random samples. A list of numbers is generated from a computer, and those are the numbers that the researchers called. This is problematic today because those numbers need to be listed to have a chance of being chosen. Many cell phones are not listed anywhere, and many people no longer have a landline. I mean, how many of you have a landline in your home? Or, if you live in an apartment, how many do you have your own landline? Probably nobody does. How many of your parents still have their landline? So when you think about this, when you're thinking about people who have a landline, that might be an older subset of the population, so you may end up with more people of certain age groups answering the survey, and that can affect the reliability of it. There's also something that's called non-response bias, which occurs when people refuse to answer a poll because they're too busy, they don't care, they don't think their opinion matters. So what happens is people with more free time and or who are elderly and or lonely are more likely to take the time to answer polls because they really don't have anything else to do. So when this happens, you'll have selection bias, which is when a sample is not representative of the population being studied. And this is complicated by the growing number of individuals who will not respond to pollster questions or who screen phone calls. So if you've ever started taking a poll on your cell phone and then all of a sudden you hang up, none of that data is any good unless you complete the entire survey. And poll results are important for many reasons. One is called the bandwagon effect. So if the public sees a shift in electoral support to a candidate where the public opinion polls report as the front runner, then more people start paying attention to that person who's the front runner. This can not only affect the potential chances of that person winning, but it can also affect fundraising efforts that they have and also their future endorsements. So surveys are very important, and I encourage you, if you have the time and you get a phone call, to answer them and to let your opinions be heard. So chapter 5 ends with some thoughts on what do we want as Americans from our democratic government, and what can we do. So a major purpose of a democratic government is to ensure that political leaders will heed the public will, and as we discussed, there is a good deal of evidence suggesting that they do heed the public will. The problem is determining what the public will actually is and whose preferences should prevail. Some political scientists argue that government policy is much less responsive on the issues that really count, and that when the interests of the elites are at stake, they are more likely to be represented. And we'll talk about that more in other chapters, about who's actually having more of an influence on the elected officials. And also, technology has changed how public opinion is shaped and evaluated. Technological advancements will bring further changes to our understanding of the relationship between public opinion, government, and media. While it has become easier to stay informed, there are also so many more offerings of things to do or watch that people are able to ignore current events completely if they so choose. So just a couple of things that you can do to be an informed consumer of opinion polls, just to reiterate. When you encounter information from opinion polls, consider the source of the poll, the question wording, and whether the individuals were randomly selected to participate, or whether they were self-selected. You can also go to realclearpolitics.com to see polls about the same issues from different sources. Pay attention to the margins of error. The lower the margin of error, the more scientific it is. And notice how aggregating the polls can make a difference. And like I said, if you're asked, consider responding to an opinion poll, because your voice is important, especially in the under 30 age group, because those are people who may not necessarily get the calls because they don't have a landline. So that's it for chapter 5. There is a lot of information in this chapter, so if you have any questions, please email me and let me know. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week.